Hey there. You know that feeling when you're like, man, if only I had like a little extra cash? Well, today we're going deep into something that might just be the answer to that. Universal basic income, or as most people call it, UBI. Basically, it's this idea that everyone would get a regular payment, no strings attached, straight from the government. And you sent us a ton of research on this, everything from like the history of UBI to experiments happening right now. I gotta say, it's pretty mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah, it really is. UBI is definitely having like a major moment right now. And what's really fascinating to me is that it's not just some abstract theory anymore. We're seeing it tested out all over the world with some really interesting results.
Okay, so hold on. Before we get too deep, can we just like quickly define what UBI is, just so everyone's on the same page?
Sure thing. Basically, UBI is like a regular no strings attached cash payment that the government gives to every single citizen. The important thing here is that it's unconditional, meaning everyone gets it. It doesn't matter how much money you make, if you have a job or not, anything like that.
Gotcha. So it's like no applications, no proving you need it, just a guaranteed income for everyone.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm already hooked. So where do we even start with all this research you sent? What really stood out to you?
Well, one of the things that really blew my mind was this program called Give Directly in Kenya. They're giving an entire village as a basic income for 12 years. That's a long time.
12 years. That's serious commitment. What have they found so far?
Yeah, it's incredible. The results have been really impressive. They've seen things like better nutrition and health, less stress. And the thing that I find most inspiring is this surge in entrepreneurial activity. People are actually using this money to start businesses, invest in their communities, and really take control of their lives.
Wow, it's amazing. And I remember reading this one story that really stuck with me.
I think you're talking about that group of widowed sister wives who pooled their UBI money together to start a bank, specifically for women in their village.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the one. It's just such a powerful example of how UBI can empower people, especially women who often face a lot of barriers when it comes to money and finances.
Right. It's totally different from the usual narrative around poverty and aid. You know, the one where people assume that folks will just waste the money or become dependent on it. Give Directly operates from a place of trust, and the evidence shows that that trust is actually paying off.
So what's so different about this trust-based approach? What's going on in those villages that's not happening with traditional aid programs?
Well, one thing is that a lot of traditional aid comes with all these strings attached.
Yeah.
You know, conditions, requirements, a ton of oversight. And that can create this feeling of shame or dependency for the people receiving it.
It's like they're constantly being told that they can't manage their own lives.
Yeah, exactly. But with the UBI, the money's given with no strings attached.
Yeah.
It's like saying, we trust you to make the best decisions for yourself and your family. And that trust, that sense of agency can be really powerful.
It makes me think about how we talk about poverty and welfare here in the U.S. There's this whole deserving versus undeserving poor thing that I just can't stand.
Yeah, that's a deep-rooted prejudice that we need to challenge UBI. Could be a way to dismantle that by saying, hey, every individual has dignity and worth no matter what their situation is.
Exactly. So building on that, would you say that Give Directly's approach in Kenya kind of turns that whole idea on its head?
I think so. By simply trusting people to use the money wisely, Give Directly, is challenging those harmful stereotypes and showing that if people have the resources, they're capable of lifting themselves out of poverty.
So it's not just about the money itself, it's about the message it sends, about shifting the power dynamics.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that people living in poverty know their own lives and needs better than anyone else.
This is already blowing my mind, and we're just getting started. So we've talked about Kenya. What about other examples of UBI around the world?
Well, Finland actually did a nationwide UBI experiment a few years ago. It didn't end up becoming a permanent policy, but they learned a lot about the potential impact and the challenges of implementing something like this.
I'm curious, what were some of the big takeaways from Finland? Did they see similar results to Kenya in terms of empowerment and positive outcomes?
There were some positive results, but the Finnish experiment was set up a bit differently. They focused on replacing existing unemployment benefits with a UBI, so it didn't have quite the same transformative effect as the Give Directly project. But it did give them some valuable insights into the logistical and political side of things. You know, how to actually roll out a UBI program on a national scale.
Interesting. So different approaches can lead to different results. What about here in the U.S.? Is anyone trying out UBI on a smaller scale?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You sent some research on a couple of key examples, including Alaska's permanent fund dividend.
Oh, yeah. For anyone who doesn't know, can you give us a quick rundown of what that program is all about?
Sure. It's basically a yearly payment that every single resident of Alaska gets. It's funded by the state's oil revenues, so it's not technically a UBI since it's coming from a specific resource, but it has that same core idea of giving everyone a share of the wealth.
I love that model. And it's been going on for decades, right?
Yeah.
What have they learned from that experience?
One of the big things is that the permanent fund dividend has become a huge part of Alaskan culture. It's not seen as a handout, but as a right, like a shared inheritance that benefits everyone.
That's like everyone's a shareholder in the state's success.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's created this sense of collective ownership and responsibility that's really special.
I wonder if that sense of responsibility could be replicated nationwide. That's definitely something to think about. Okay, so we've got these cool examples from Kenya, Finland, and even Alaska. But why is UBI suddenly so popular? Why is it having a moment right now?
I think a lot of it has to do with the growing anxiety about automation and the future of work.
Right, you hear it everywhere these days. The robots are coming for our jobs.
And while that might sound a little dramatic, technology is changing the job market in ways we've never seen before.
So is the idea that UBI could act as kind of a safety net, protecting people from the economic fallout of automation?
Exactly. If jobs become scarce, a UBI could provide a baseline of income security so people could adapt, retrain, or pursue other opportunities.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's not just about automation, right? There's also the issue of rising inequality.
Absolutely. The gap between the rich and the poor has been getting wider for decades, and a lot of people see UBI as a way to address that.
Okay, but I have to admit I'm a little skeptical. Is it really possible to give everyone a basic income? Wouldn't that be incredibly expensive?
It's a valid concern, and we'll definitely talk about the cost issue in more detail. But it's important to remember that we're already spending a ton of money on a ton of different social programs, many of which are inefficient and super bureaucratic.
So are you saying that a UBI could actually streamline things, making the whole safety net more effective and less expensive in the long run?
That's one of the arguments. We'll need to look at the numbers carefully, but the potential is definitely there.
This is so fascinating. I feel like we're just scratching the surface here, and I'm already seeing UBI in a whole new light. But before we go too far, I think we need to talk about the potential downsides.
You're right. There are definitely concerns about the impact on work, the risk of inflation, and of course the overall cost. We need to address those head on and see if they hold up. I think a good place to start is with that worry that giving people free money will make them lazy.
Yeah.
Stop them from working.
Yeah, that's like the classic argument against UBI. Like, won't everyone just kick back and live off the government?
Right. It's a totally understandable concern. But the funny thing is, the evidence from all these real-world experiments actually shows the opposite.
Really? Tell me more.
Okay, so studies of these cash transfer programs, not just Give Directly, but others too, they all basically show the same thing. People don't stop working when they get a basic income. Sometimes they actually work more.
That's so interesting. Why would that be?
Well, think about it. For a lot of people who are just barely making ends meet, finding a job, keeping a job, it's a huge source of stress. They might feel pressured to take any job they can find, even if it's a terrible job or pays almost nothing.
So it's like they're trapped. They can't really invest in themselves or look for something better.
Exactly. But UBI gives them that breathing room, that little bit of security to make different choices. They might use the money to start a business, go back to school, or maybe even take a job that pays less, but that they actually enjoy.
So instead of making people lazy, it could actually help them reach their potential and make the whole job market more dynamic.
That's the hope. It's about giving workers more power to ask for better pay and better working conditions.
Like you said before, it all comes back to trust, trusting people to make good choices for themselves and their families.
Exactly. And, when you trust people, amazing things can happen.
Okay, so maybe the whole people will stop working argument isn't really true. But what about inflation? Wouldn't giving everyone more money just make prices go up?
That's a legitimate concern for sure. But again, when you look at what's happened with these cash transfer programs, the impact on inflation is usually pretty small.
How come?
Well, first of all, UBI would probably replace a lot of the social programs we already have.
Yeah.
So it's not like a huge amount of new money is suddenly flooding into the economy.
Ah, so it's more about shifting money around than creating new money.
Right. And another thing is that UBI could actually boost the economy by making people spend more, which means businesses could grow, hire more people, and that could help offset any inflation.
So it's a balancing act, but it's not automatically going to cause prices to skyrocket.
Yeah, it's like any economic policy. It's about finding the right combination of tools to get the results you want.
Speaking of economic policy, you mentioned earlier that the U.S. already spends a lot of money on social programs. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. The U.S. has this really complicated system of safety nets. Programs like food stamps, welfare, housing assistance, disability benefits, all kinds of things. And these programs can be really hard to navigate. Lots of red tape and bureaucracy.
Yeah, and you sent over some stories about people who fell through the cracks of that system. And those stories were really tough to read.
Right, like the stories of Carolyn Silvies and Jenner Barrington Ward. They really show how our current system can actually make it harder for people to escape poverty.
Carolyn became homeless and just couldn't figure out how to get the help she needed. And Jenner was told he was too articulate to work at McDonald's. It's heartbreaking.
It really shows how broken the system is. So the question is, could UBI be a better way to do this whole thing?
Yeah. Could it be a more effective and fair way to provide support and opportunity?
That's what a lot of UBI supporters are saying. They think it could replace a lot of these existing programs, making the whole system simpler and more equitable.
So instead of applying for a million different things and filling out mountains of paperwork, everyone would just get a basic income, no questions asked.
Exactly. And that could free up government money to invest in other things like education, healthcare infrastructure, you name it.
It sounds like a radical change, but also maybe a really good one.
It's definitely a bold idea, but it's gaining traction as we see these problems getting worse. Automation inequality. The way work is changing. It's all coming together.
I get it. I'm starting to see the appeal. But how would we even pay for something like this? Where would the money come from?
That's the million-dollar question. There are a few different ideas out there.
Like what?
Well, some people think we should have a more progressive tax system where people who earn more pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. Others think we should have a financial transaction tax, like a small fee on every stock trade or bank transfer.
What about things like a wealth tax or changing the estate tax? Could those help?
Yeah, those are definitely options.
Yeah.
And they could bring in a lot of money, especially from people who are already doing really well in the current system.
It sounds like there are ways to make it work if we're willing to have those tough conversations about money and priorities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about rethinking our social contract, recognizing that we're all in this together.
Okay, so the money thing. We've talked about that a little bit. But what about how this would change society? How people think about work and their place in the world?
That's a really interesting question. And it's one of the things that makes UBI so fascinating. It forces us to ask, what does work even mean? What kind of work is valuable? What makes a good life? These are big questions.
You included some research about unpaid care work, which is something we don't talk about enough.
Right. It's a huge part of the economy that we just ignore. Things like taking care of kids, taking care of elderly parents. Housework, all of that adds up to trillions of dollars globally, but nobody really acknowledges it.
And it's mostly women doing that work.
Yeah, definitely. UBI could be a way to finally recognize and value that work. Give caregivers more options and more financial security.
Like that story about Veronica Giron, the home health aide in Nevada. She's taking care of other people's elderly parents and kids and raising her own kids at the same time. That's the kind of work that holds our society together, but it's invisible most of the time.
Exactly. UBI could help level the playing field. Make sure that all work is valued, paid or unpaid.
It's like we're finally acknowledging that our whole economy is built on this foundation of care work, but we pretend it's not there.
Right. And UBI could be a way to bring that work out into the open, say that it matters, and make sure the people doing it are treated fairly.
So it's not just about giving people money. It's about changing how we think about value and work.
Yeah, it's about creating a system where everyone's contribution is recognized, no matter what their job is or how much money they make.
This is really making me think differently about work and wealth and what it means to live a good life. It's a big shift.
That's what ideas are supposed to do, right? They challenge us to look at things in new ways.
But realistically, could something like this actually happen in the U.S.? Our political system is so divided. Could we ever get everyone on board with something this big?
It's definitely a huge challenge, but there are signs that things are changing, even in places you wouldn't expect.
You mentioned the Climate Leadership Council before.
Yeah, they're pushing for a carbon tax. But the interesting part is they want to give all the money from that tax back to people as a dividend, which is kind of like UBI.
And they have support from both conservatives and liberals, which is pretty amazing.
Right. It shows that maybe there is some common ground on these issues that usually divide us.
Maybe people are starting to realize that the old ways aren't working anymore, and we need new solutions that work for everyone.
Exactly. UBI is making us have those important conversations about work, about the government, about what we owe to each other.
It's about moving past those old arguments and looking for new ideas that could create a better future.
A more just and sustainable future for everyone.
Yeah. It's like we're having to totally rethink work in the 21st century. I mean,
Yeah.
what if all the robots really take our jobs? Like, what happens then? Do we just accept that a bunch of people will be out of work? Or do we try to find new ways to share wealth and create opportunities for everyone, even if there aren't enough traditional jobs, you know?
Yeah. Those are the big questions we need to be thinking about right now. And UBI is just one part of it. We also need to think about access to education, affordable housing, good health care. It's all connected. We need to create a system where everyone has the chance to not just survive, but actually thrive.
Yeah, it's about investing in people, not just handing out money. Creating a world where everyone can reach their full potential.
Exactly. It's about making sure the economy works for people, not the other way around.
I like that. But honestly, even after all this talk about UBI, I still have some doubts. How do we actually make this happen? How do we convince people, especially the skeptics, that this is something worth fighting for?
That's the tough part, right? It's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah.
We need to have these conversations everywhere, in our communities, with our politicians, in the media. We need to share stories, show people the data, and bust those myths about UBI.
It's about changing the story, right? Instead of talking about handouts, we need to talk about empowerment and shared prosperity.
Exactly. We need to show people that UBI isn't some crazy socialist idea. It's a practical solution to real problems, like poverty inequality, the disappearing middle class.
And it's not just about convincing the people who don't believe it. It's about building a movement.
Oh, yeah. We need to get people excited and involved. Create a force that can't be ignored. And that means bringing in all kinds of different voices and perspectives.
Like those groups, the Economic Security Project and Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, they're doing some really cool stuff on the ground, pushing for UBI and similar policies.
They are. And they're making real progress.
Yeah.
We're seeing UBI pilot programs popping up all across the country, which is awesome. Those programs are giving us valuable data and proving that UBI can actually change lives.
So it's about showing that it works, not just talking about it.
Exactly. As we see more evidence, as we hear more stories about how UBI is making a difference, more and more people will get on board.
It's about changing minds, one conversation at a time. But what about unintended consequences? We can't see the future, so how do we know UBI won't cause problems we haven't even thought of yet?
It's true. You can never eliminate all risk. But we can minimize it by designing the program carefully, putting in safeguards, and being willing to adjust things as we learn.
So being flexible is key, not being stuck in one way of thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have to be open to feedback, new information. And yeah, maybe we'll need to change course along the way, but that shouldn't stop us from trying.
Because the way things are now clearly isn't working. And if we wait, it's only going to get worse. We need to be bold, think outside the box, and be willing to take some risks. Because the potential benefits are huge.
Imagine a world where everyone has the security to follow their dreams, contribute to their communities, and live with dignity. That's what we're aiming for.
That's a world worth fighting for, isn't it? A world without poverty, where everyone has a chance, and where we value every human being, not just how much money they make.
Well said. And hey,
Yeah.
who knows? Maybe someday even George Jetson will be paying taxes to support a UBI program.
I love it. Well, I think that about covers it. We went deep on UBI today. What a fascinating conversation.
It really was. I hope this got our listeners thinking, maybe even inspired them to learn more about this.
Me too. Keep digging, keep asking questions, and keep having those important conversations about the future we want. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into universal basic income. See you next time.